On March 19, 2011, President Barack Obama said this.
Today, I authorize the Armed Forces of the United States to begin a limited military action in Libya in support of an international effort to protect Libyan civilians.
What happened next was a good president or a leader is not known by what he says, his charming personality, or even his beauty and physical appearance. A good leader is known for his policies and how these policies affect the people both for long term and short term, and both positively or negatively. The attack on Libya began with Operation Odessa Dawn. Yes, Odessa. I think the only Odessa Libyans got was misery, because this operation led to the worst human calamities on Africa since the 1980s, and it has led to the death of more than 1 million people and the displacement of more than 50 million, the unstable governments, the rise of terrorism, and countless of other problems in Africa. And thanks to Obama and his speech and his decision to have military actions on Libya, let us go into details. To see how Obama became the Hitler of Africa, we have to understand the effects that the Libyan war had on other sub-Saharan countries and other African countries. But we have to first understand the background of all this before we get where we are now. For America and its allies to invade Libya, it was based on two premises. One, the false narrative that the Western countries needed to protect civilians, which is very ironical because in the long run, it is the civilians who have suffered the most and continues to suffer. Two, the second, and of which I believe is the best, is the West's selfish needs and the access to Libyan oil and natural resources. Here's Obama telling the truth.
But when our interests and values are at stake, we have a responsibility to act. That's what's happened in Libya over the course of these last 6 weeks.
Begin Egypt and Tunisia, who had themselves disposed their dictators in the term that was later called Arab Spring, that was aimed to bring regime change. However, the death of Gaddafi created a power vacuum. This created internal conflict that escalated into a civil war, the Second Libyan Civil War. This led to an estimated death of 14,882, which were mostly civilians, with the refugees and internal displaced people reaching about at least 435,000. And of this recording of this video in 2024, Libya is in a political stalemate with no official government, insecurity, violence and intimidation against civilians. It would be right to ascertain that Libya is a failed state. Just like how the African Union feared Libya became another failed state like Somalia. The people who are suffering the most are the civilians, the ones Obama claimed to be protecting. Two, the problems Libyans are facing are terrible, and we continue to pray for them. However, there is something so terrible than the power vacuum: the prolifications of weapons. It was estimated that Gaddafi had more than 700,000 stockpiles of weapons and ammunition. Then the Western countries like France, Turkey, and Qatar brought in millions of weapons to support the Libyan rebels to win the war. And this had the worst either intended or otherwise effects. Immediately after the Libyan First Civil War and the collapse of Gaddafi, hundreds of thousands of weapons started to move south to the terrorists and the rebels that were located in the Sahel region. The saddest part was, these weapons were in the most cases more advanced than the governments of the Sahel countries had, and this made terrorists and rebels more dangerous than what we had witnessed in any African history. It was the new frontier of the war, the rise of terrorism in Africa. Keep in mind that Africa was the continent that was healing from the old wars and political instabilities of the 70s and 90s, thanks to in large part colonialism and its crazy division of Africa. These weapons and the fall of Libya is the cause of these terrible things we're going to see. Before I answer the question how Obama became the Hitler of Africa and how he took Africa back to the 70s, we need to first understand the effects of Libyan war on the rest of African countries, but in particular the Sahel region. I want to focus on the three elements. 1. Civil wars. The first victim of the Libyan war was Mali. Mali had since from the late 1990s had internal conflict with the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, an organization that had been fighting for the independence of Azawad, a state for the Tuareg people. However, the Libyan civil war had brought something new. After the end of the Libyan civil war, an influx of weaponry led to the arming of the Tuareg in the demand for independence. The strength of this uprising and the use of the heavy weapons, which were not present in the previous conflicts, were said to have surprised Malian officials and observers. These are the weapons that were supplied to Libya by the Western nations and through the eyes of Obama. The Malian civil war is still ongoing and has led to the displacement of more than 374,000 people and more than 10,000 people dead, especially civilians. Again, civilians Obama wanted to protect. You might think this is the worst to happen, but you would be excused for your understatements. Why can't we see the next biggest problem? 2. Coups. We said that the new weapons had brought havoc to the region and the governments were not prepared for these weapons. Since the fall of Gaddafi, there have been about 22 coups and coup attempts in Africa. 20 of these came from the Sahel region, the neighboring countries of Libya. Actually, that is 10% more coups than the last 2 former decades combined. The major cause of these coups is the results of how these governments were or are handling the insurgencies rising from the effects of Libyan civil war, and also rebels who had accessed the advanced weapons from the Libyan crisis. The problem of coups is putting heavy burden on regional bodies, for example ECOWAS, decline in economic growth and having unstable governments that in most cases participate in human rights abuse and deepen ethnic divisions. All in all, the lives of civilians got worse than imaginable. Can I say it again, that the same civilians Obama wanted to protect? 3. Insurgents in the Sahara. This is the saddest part of the video. If you see the state of Africa today, you cry. Terrorism in Africa has risen more than 2,000%. Africa represented 1% in 2007, but now Africa represents more than 43% of all global terrorism activities that have happened presently. Again, this is the saddest part. In 2022, there were 19,412 reported deaths from terrorist attack in Africa, but that number has climbed by 20% to 23,322 in 2023 and still growing in 2024. These insurgencies and extremes have bred nothing but trouble and suffering in the African continent, and the Sahel region has become the breeding ground for the terrorism group like Jamaat Insulat al-Islam wa Muslim and Islamic State of Greater Sahara, which are in turn extensions of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And here is another fact: most of the insurgencies are in the Sahel regions, which are the countries that got the weapons from Libyan crisis. For every modern problem Africa faces, especially in instabilities, there is a higher chances that it is related to Libyan civil war. And now millions of Africans are dying as a direct of this. And don't forget the calamities that came with the wars and instabilities like diseases, famine, and destructions of the much needed properties and infrastructure we cannot even imagine. The problem of Obama. Now it's the time to answer the problem of Obama and address how this guy is the Hitler with a smile. We have seen that most of African problems were exacerbated by Obama's illegal invasion of Libya. However, I want to express that Obama himself and the West were not the cause. Most of these problems came from the old days and were the results of the post-colonial Africa. The distinction should come in form of the advanced weapons that were brought to Libya and also the stockpiles of Gaddafi weapons stolen as the result of the fall of Gaddafi. These weapons became the fuel for internal conflict that were happening in Africa, and they outdid all the progress Africa had done and brought Africa back to its knees. And all of this is as a result of Obama because 1. Obama as the president of America and NATO, as a result, had the highest power and authorization of stopping the invading of a foreign country and had also power and authorization to use other channels of peace and using regional power. The African Union itself has its mandate on protecting civilians. Libya was a member of the African Union and not a NATO member. If this Hitler wanted to use an excuse of protecting civilians, he needed to use the AU, which he took as a useless group, and now everything is in shambles. AU is not perfect, but it knows when its civilians are being attacked, it has the responsibility to interfere. Article 4H of the Constitutive Act of the African Union states, the right of the Union to interfere in a member state pursuant to a decision of the Assembly in respect of the grave circumstances, namely war crimes, genocide, and crime against humanity. AU has been interfering when its civilians are at the risk, from Somalia to Mali of the recent. Yes, Mali has been suffering from Obama war. So why didn't Obama use AU to solve the Libyan crisis? Why didn't Obama pressurize other bodies on the issue of Libya? Why didn't Obama use other means first? Why? Why? 2. I know comparing Obama to Hitler is unfair, but it is very, very hard for me not to do it when there are a lot of similarities, like Obama's short-sightedness. When he came into power, he had seen the effects of wars in the Middle East with countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, and how these wars had led to the rise of terrorism and instability in the Middle East. But he went ahead and invaded Libya? What is the difference with that of invading of Poland in 1939? Because both wanted to spread their ideologies but ended up causing a lot of human suffering. So Obama had blood on his hands, and everything that happens in the Sahel region and is as a result of Libyan civil war, it all goes to his hands. Let's listen to his speech again.
But when our interests and values are at stake, we have a responsibility to act. That's what's happened in Libya over the course of these last 6 weeks.
And it is this speech that made him the most hated US president by Africans, to the level of Donald Trump, who called the global world as,
said, this is a quote, "Why are we having all these people from shithole countries come here? People from shithole countries come here. People from shithole countries come here."
Yet Obama was half African and was the most beloved president in Africa before the 2011 speech. Remember, Obama came and every African loved this guy. But after Libya, it is safe to say that he is a Trump's brother, not ours. Obama apology on invading Libya. It's not right to give such harsh criticism, then don't give the other side of the story. Later, Obama came out and apologized for invading Libya. Well, some people might say it's a good gesture, others might say it is meaningless. My question is, how does this help the civilians of Libya that are suffering and he meant to protect? How does the apology help the Sahel that is now plagued with the problem? How does this apology help? Sir, Africa needs its own reliance, not you coming with the big guns, destroying our societies, then after giving us that half-baked apology and some little aid. If you couldn't help Africa, it was better to leave it alone. Thanks for watching. See you next.